So we cannot afford not to have hope. We must have hope. This new Rwanda we are trying to build, even amidst all the suffering that we see around us in Rwanda, we must have hope. And number three, to tell the Rwandan people that we shall overcome, that it's possible to overcome, because we are not alone. Human history always shows across the entire landscape of history, from all other societies that we know in Africa, in elsewhere, whenever people in their mindset have decided that they are going to overcome their fear, that they are going to hope for a better future for themselves, for their children and their grandchildren. And whenever they have worked together, that's putting together your efforts, not fighting in a small corner in isolation, but fighting as, resisting as Rwandans, resisting as people wanting to build a future for all Rwandans, where we have equal opportunity, where we have equality before the law, good laws, not equality before bad laws, and where there are institutions that govern us, where there is leadership that is chosen amongst the people, instead of a ruler who says, I was born with divine powers and I'm here to stay until I want to go, until I die, where there is at least that rule of law, which and the basic rights of the people, where you wake up and say, I'm glad I'm Sixbert. I can go wherever I want. I can say whatever I want. I can do whatever I want, as long as what you're doing and what you're saying is not actually impinging, stepping on the toes of your fellow citizen. Then that thing, you are free to do it.
This is Radio ISHAKWE, the voice of ISHAKWE Rwanda Freedom Movement, a Rwandan opposition party in exile. We are broadcasting from Washington, D.C., United States of America, and our program is aired every Monday at 15. In today's program, our guest is Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, and the topic is Let Us Build a New Sustainable Rwanda. This is an introductory program that will be followed by part 1, 2, 3, and more, talking about the old and collapsing Rwanda, the Rwanda of recurrent massacres, genocide, human rights violations, lack of rule of law, ethnic discrimination. We are talking about the new Rwanda, our dream for future generation. Today's guest, Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, chairman of ISHAKWE Rwanda Freedom Movement, former Secretary General of the Rwanda Patriotic Front, former Rwandan ambassador to the United States, and currently in exile. Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sixbert. Thank you for giving me this time. Well, once again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I welcome all the listeners to this program in English. We know that there are so many people, not only in Rwanda and the region of Africa where we belong, that do regularly listen to this program and have given us positive feedback so far. And we know that this is something that other people across the world, here in America, in Europe, and the rest of the world, there are so many people interested in knowing a little more about Rwanda, because the events of 1994, the genocide of 1994, the civil war of 1990 that began 1990, and what followed in our region until now, the turbulence and disruption that has been going on in our region, that somehow has a relationship to the events of 1994, have created an appetite for knowing a little about Rwanda. Surprisingly, even those people who may not know much about Rwanda they always know that there are these people called Hutus and Tutsis. But of course, they simplify it. Since they know that bad things happened in Rwanda, they often ask, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? And you always wonder how to respond to such a question. I used to respond it in one way 30 years ago, but now I find it quite difficult because indeed, who are the good guys amongst Rwandans and who are the bad guys? And so it's, as you introduced, it's proper that we should be talking about the old and collapsing or old Rwanda that is passing away, as many other previous versions of Rwanda have come and gone. We shall be talking about the foundations of that old Rwanda, old Rwandas, because the current one under Kagame is not the first one, but we shall be talking about what are the similarities and differences between these old Rwandas that seem to come and pass away sooner than later. But for now, for today's program, we are talking about the context that produced the regime of General Kagame, who has been the president of Rwanda since 2004, but who previously, even since 1994, held power behind the curtains because he was then vice president under the then president of Rwanda, Pastor Bizimungu. But it's very important to give that kind of context so that people understand how we came to be here. And so as people know, any good student of history will know that we are all products of history. And we are all products of geography, and we are products of the nature of the society in which we are born and raised. And so the interaction between our history, our geography, the nature of society, the nature of history, how in the past we are governed, somehow determines how we come to be in the current circumstances. In the case of Rwanda, I want to give this very short summary in about 15 minutes. I'm going to time myself. Rwanda is found at the center of Africa, and the map of Africa, which of course is a recent thing, which also shaped what Rwanda became. The map of Africa, if you look on the map of Africa, it's like patchwork, currently I think we're about 54 countries. The recent newcomer being South Sudan. But that patchwork, Africa was not always like that. If you looked at the map of Africa in 1800s, that's not how we looked like. There were kingdoms and empires, and because politically we are organized in a different way. Even Europe of 1600s and 1800s looked different from what it is, but particularly the Africa we see right now is a product of the Berlin Conference of 1895, if I'm not mistaken. And so if you look at the map of Africa, Rwanda is there at the heart of Africa. Small country, 26, about slightly more than 26,000 square kilometers. Its neighbors are currently Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan to the south, Burundi to the south, Tanzania to the east, and Uganda, partly Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo at the north as well. And so that is the geography that has shaped Rwanda. Whereas the saying goes, we don't choose neighbors; those are the neighbors. Even under different names, before they are called those names, Those were our neighbors. In terms of its people, the way Rwandans are described, I don't know whether they were always described like that. We normally say we are Abanyarwanda, Rwandese people. But beneath that generalization of calling ourselves Rwandese or the citizens of Rwanda, we are also historically described as Hutus, Tutsis, and Twa. These are the three ethnic groups that comprise the population of Rwanda. A small population, just to give an example, I think maybe I won't delve so much in the actual numbers, but currently we are a population of 13 million, over 13 million. And given the fact of the genocide of 1994, we were roughly at that time, Sixbert, you might remind me, at the time of the invasion, were we even 7 million or were 6 point something? Remind me.
Yeah, that time officially Rwandans were about 7 millions that time.
Yes, yes. And so in about, just to show you, and we shall be coming to that in later programs, it shows you that in about 30 years, the population of Rwanda has doubled. So we are one of the most densely populated areas of the world. And often we are described as the land of 1,000 hills because the topography of Rwanda is hilly. There are so many hills. And indeed, the hill was even an administrative kind of entity because that's where people resided. So it was more or less the hill, almost as it was an administrative structure. So that's the demography and the population of Rwanda. In addition to that, then we would have to mention that for most of the known history, Rwanda's history is oral. So until fairly recently, when we started learning how to read and write with the introduction of religion in Rwanda and the advent of colonialism, we learned by being told by our elders what they knew, and we passed it on to our children, and they also passed it to their own children. That is how people learned. A very effective way, but still, of course, compared to other written cultures that date back even for, thousands of years before Christ, in Mesopotamia, you would say that we're not yet catching up with that technology of writing. But for that known part of history, we knew that Rwanda was also ruled by kings, which does not mean that there are no other structures of governance. There were in Rwanda and in that whole region that we call the Great Lakes region or the Intercastrian region or the region between the lakes, the big lakes that you find there, like Lake Victoria, which is known the source of the Nile, Lake Choga, Lake Edward, Lake Albert. So that is in that area, there were other political formations, social political formation that, rose in that region, but were part of it. But Rwanda was ruled by kings that were hailed from one particular ethnic group, the Tutsi, and even among the Tutsi from one particular clan. So fast forward, at the end of the 19th century, the German colonialists, the European colonialism in Rwanda, like in the rest of Africa, The Germans took over, as the new colonial masters of Rwanda. They did not live in Rwanda for a long time, but their impact was probably not as extensive as the Belgians who came after them. But still, that was very decisive because it came at a time when also the kingship in Rwanda was in turmoil because of the squabbles that took place at the famous transition and conflict at Ruchunchu that ended up wiping off the traditional, Nyiginya clan rulers who had ruled Rwanda for most of that known history, in which the kings were the rulers of Rwanda. And so that followed the period of colonialism, first the Germans and then the Belgians. We won't go into that. Maybe in future, other people will come to talk about the nature of the impact of colonialism, whether it's the introduction of the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church or the Christian Church in general, introduction of education in Rwanda, and introduction, of course, of capitalism, producing for markets, and especially since also the colonials were interested in producing for their own metropolitan economies, also alongside what was happening in Congo, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Burundi, and elsewhere in Africa. So that is a bit of the colonial process. And then at the turn of the 50s, because power had always been organized along ethnic lines and within ethnic lines along the Tutsi kings, the colonial authorities had been careful enough at the very beginning to depend on the kings as the ones who would dispense their rule on behalf of the colonial authorities. They didn't want, it was a system of indirect rule. So the kings are there, you go through them to dispense your rule. Even the harsh conditions that you impose on the population are seen to be coming from the king and his chiefs. So it's not direct that people will see, oh, the harsh realities have come from the colonial authorities. It was not as automatic as that. But certainly the issue of Hutu-Tutsi kind of division started having a new dimension in that people saw the chiefs who are dispensing the colonial rule as being the ones actually being very, very harsh. And so that distinction started having a very serious political repercussion within the Rwandan society. Now, at the turn of the 50s, the colonial authorities, having educated some people, amongst them Hutus and Tutsis as well, a new Hutu elite was emerging that started posing the question as to why that kind of imbalance existed in society. Not so much even questioning the colonial administration, but questioning the monarch as to why the Hutu people should be perpetually be subjects like everybody, but subjects of a second-class status. And so there came the 1959 revolution, in which emerged a new Hutu elite, amongst them, of course, the first president of Rwanda, who was Mbonyumutwa, right? Sixbert, and then after independence in 1962, right, came another president who that time became
Dominique Mbonyumutwa was
the first
interim
one.
president, yes, interim president.
Yes.
And then that time, Gregoire Kayibanda was prime minister.
The prime minister,
And,
yes.
Then with the independence, Gregoire Kayibanda became the new president of Rwanda.
Yes. So one of the consequences of that transition to to independence was that also the monarchy was abolished. And once the monarchy was abolished, also under conditions, I forgot to mention that towards that time of independence, political parties were formed. They were not entirely, Hutu parties and Tutsi parties, but there were political parties that thought that they could engage in the whole democratic experiment of demanding change, that change would bring more about equality and justice within the Rwandan society. But of course, the monarchists were kind of resistant because they wanted the colonial process to end, but they also wanted to maintain the status quo. The other political groups, but notably one, MDR Parmehutu, wanted the justice, and if even the colonial process could delay, but for them the most important contradiction was the monarchy that, of course, had lasted for too long within the Rwandan society, which was the basis of inequality within Rwanda. And so with the new power structures dominated by the Hutu elite, of course, the monarchies, members of the old order, the old Rwanda were actually collapsing. The order was collapsing, was passing away. And with its passing, of course, there were very many victims. And the victims, of course, there were Tutsi victims and Hutu victims, but predominantly the losers in that power game were the Tutsi elite, the monarchies, but alongside them, ordinary Tutsis. And that began the refugee problem of Rwanda. That became one of the earliest on the African continent at the turn of, in the early 60s, that would continue and still continues up to today. Now, of course, the First Republic under President Kayibanda, whatever it did, it did not look into the face of the realities of the old order and see how could it rectify the conditions to the extent that at least all Rwandans, the Hutus and Tutsis, could have a sense of belonging to this new Rwanda that Kayibanda and company were creating. But instead, persecution of the Tutsis, and I'm sure you will assist me on that, Sixbert, to amplify it a bit. Tutsis became like second-class citizens from that time, when the monarchies and the old order lost, and most of them became refugees, including the king himself, as well as many people perished, especially those who might have remained behind, either because they thought they were part of a new political grouping. But every time there was an attack by these new monarchies and the Tutsis refugees from exile, always the victims, the regime would descend on people and kill quite a good number of them, as it became very common. Now, fast forward, I'm leaping forward, 1973, the original kind of Hutu elite who were united by being Hutu, there was a schism within that group. And so by 1973, there was a military coup under President Juvenal Habyarimana, who came from the north. So for many people who outsiders sometimes wonder even how a small country, as I have described it, could have even other sections, small sections within it. But that's the truth. And so the Hutus from the north, called Abachiga in our language, or the Chigas, sometimes English speakers decide to call them Chiga or Nduga, but it simply means the the Hutus from the north. Because he was from the north, he organized his power alongside his fellow family members and Hutus from the north. So it became a small Hutu elite within the larger Hutu elite, and the Hutu elite from the south were marginalized. And subsequent to the coup d'etat of 1973, many of them, almost the entire elite was wiped out. They were killed successively, which remains one of the unresolved and unclosed chapters, tragic chapters of Rwanda's recent history. Fast forward in 1990, because once again, the contradictions within Rwanda itself, the broader Rwanda, where now we have that problem of refugees, we have the problem of Hutu Tutsi, we have a problem of Northern Hutu and Southern Hutu. You have the problem of a small economy that is not expanding and impoverished peasantry. We have always been predominantly peasant economy with people living on subsistence agriculture. Our families are very large because on average, in the past, a mother would in her lifetime would produce maybe 6 to 8 children. Quite a good number of them would die in infancy. Other surviving ones would grow up to figure out how to increasingly share the small piece of land on which you are born. Problems that, under cash crop economy, where the only two exports were coffee and tea. You have the problem of governance in the country, where this was, I didn't mention that this was under Kayibanda, it was a one-party rule. It became progressively one-party rule. Under the military regime, it started as a military government, but they formed their own party, the MRND party, the sole party in the country to which everyone belonged to. There are problems of insecurity, persecution continued. And in the meantime, people like us who had become refugees had become of age and were beginning to ask the question, why are we refugees? Why are we here? Why should we remain refugees forever? And so it's under these conditions that the Rwandese Patriotic Front was born. On the 1st of October 1990, that's when RPF, with its armed wing, the Rwandese Patriotic Army, invaded Rwanda. Now, Sixbert, I'm sure I've used more than 15 minutes, but I've tried. I've tried to give the entire history of Rwanda of 200, almost, 300 centuries maybe, in the shortest possible time. But I think you may wish maybe to highlight if there are some important things I might have forgotten to try and remind the listeners. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed, Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA. Thanks for this rich and fruitful introduction. Here I can quote some writers like Ellen Keller, who wrote, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." And I have in mind as well Isaac Newton. If I have seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. And from this, I would like to ask you, are we building from scratch, or are there some giants or cultural pillars to build from? I remember a certain time we recommended, as we were just discussing, you said, you referred to the flight of the Phoenix, that story of that movie of 1965, if I remember well. The story that follows a small group of men struggling to survive in the Sahara Desert after their aircraft has crashed in the desert, and they managed to build a new one from one wing, and that new one took them to safety. How, in your vision, how could we build a new Rwanda from some pillars, some existing pillars, and make sure that we have a stronger foundation and stronger pillars?
Well, that is really the bigger question, the foundational question, which we shall be trying to respond to in subsequent programs. That is the agenda, really. We are trying to answer in these coming programs that question that you are asking. But to give a bit of context to that, you might recall that in 1990, on October 1st, 1990, when RPF invaded Rwanda from Uganda, in a way that was attempt to respond to that question, because we invaded saying we want actually to create a new Rwanda. You might recall, and I'm sure listeners
Yes,
would like
that's
to
why I
hear
wanted to
from
ask you a
you.
question about that. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
because we are
that was
trying
my
to
next
say,
question, actually.
yes. So I'm jumping ahead a bit, but simply to say that every new generation somehow awakens to the fact that the status quo, the conditions as they exist, are not sustainable. And it doesn't take anybody to be a very distinguished scholar, a distinguished author, to be educated with degrees, to be of divine power, to know that the conditions in which people are living cannot continue forever. When RPF invaded in 1990, part of some of the popularity later on gained with time, or at least people understood, like people like you were in the country, for us who are coming from outside, was that you could give us a benefit of doubt because we're asking a question whose time has come. I forget who said that once again, I'm paraphrasing, but once in a while, a question becomes so urgent that it has to be asked. If you don't ask an urgent question, an important question, whether it's in science or economics or anywhere, you cannot give a good answer because good answers are found from asking very good questions. So what you asked is a very good question. And in 1990, IPF was trying to ask that question. And how could we build a new Rwanda from the existing Rwanda that existed? And that question was asked by the fathers of the 1959 revolution. Kayibanda and company and Mbonyumutwa and their colleagues amongst the Hutu and amongst the Tutsi from the little history of Rwanda that I've read in the books and I've gained from you people who had the
Actually,
word.
yeah,
They
the
were
leaders
Tutsis
of the
too.
revolution, among them were Tutsis, and
Yes,
unfortunately they have been
they were
executed
also
in
killed.
1963 by
Yes,
the Young Republic.
yes. And so the people who said, no, this system that has served Rwanda for maybe 200 years, maybe 300 years under Tutsi kings, Nyiginya kings, that this kind of order cannot continue like this, where everyone is a subject, and amongst the subjects, there are first-class subjects and second-class subjects and third-class subjects and so on and so forth, being the basis, the foundation in which you build a society. So in 1959, the authors of 1959 had posed a very good question, a very fundamental question. They tried to answer it, but they didn't answer it sufficiently. Maybe they hadn't studied it sufficiently. in the same way that we shall be arguing and saying that RPF tried to respond to a need of the time, tried to ask a very good question, but in trying to answer, they try to avoid the question. Now they try to avoid the question that they should have answered. And so to build, once again, as I said in the very beginning, the starting place is your society. To build is to start with the nature of your society and your history and your geography and your interaction with your neighborhood, interaction with the rest of the world, because that's how social and political formations exist. They grow and then finally they decline. And those that are very unfortunate, there are so many of them, and the majority in history, they finally collapse. Even empires, Sixbert, even empires or big powers, as we shall be giving many, many examples, especially when we come to diplomacy, we shall be showing that even for a small enclave called Rwanda, for Kagame to imagine that he's building something permanent, as he always argues, you've listened to him, many people have listened to him, it's as if he has built something permanent.
No, actually, he looks like he's trying to copy what the monarchy was doing. He's trying to copy that old age, trying to see, to use it for now. And I think it can't be sustainable. It can't be.
Yeah, because you see, if he's once again, he's a very bad student. He's a very poor student. Because if you're a good student, you would ask the question, if the kings existed, ruled like that, where power was derived from divine powers. In Rwanda, they say ngo umwami yavukanye imbuto, that the king is born with the seeds of rule.
Yes.
Because you inherit, and initially that power was given by some divine power. One of your descendants certainly is also born with the same seeds of rule. That's how Kagame is behaving right now. But he would have understood that if that could be overthrown by the colonial powers coming from outside Africa, and then both colonial powers and the monarchy came to fade away in the early 60s, why can't Kagame learn that lesson and ask, what are the factors that led the monarchy to finally decline during the colonial process and then collapse at the time of the Hutu Revolution? Or why did the regime of President Kayibanda, based on a Hutu majority concept, rise, decline, and finally fall in 1973? Or why President Habyarimana's regime, based on brute violence and brute military force, take over power,
discrimination as well, and
discrimination, rise, decline, and finally be overthrown by the RPF? Those are the questions that Kagame should be asking, because logically, if you understood all that, you will see that the foundations have always been the same up to now. The foundation of kingship, the foundation of colonialism, the foundation of the Kayibanda regime, the foundation of the Habyarimana regime, and the foundation of the RPF regime are one and the same. They may be different in terms of the fact that Kagame's regime is a Tutsi minority, a Tutsi clique within a Tutsi minority. Habyarimana's regime was a Hutu clique, Chiga clique, as you call it. I've learned this element of Chiga and Nduga I didn't understand before.
Yes.
Yes, but it was a Chiga clique within the wider Hutu majority. The colonial authorities are even a tinier foreign minority within the country, within a population, in this case of Rwanda. And in the case of kings, whether they ruled 200 years or 300 years, I have no idea. But for a long time, the only rule that was sustained over a long period of time was built on a very tiny Tutsi minority within one particular clan, in a Tutsi minority within the broader population. So the foundation has been the same. Discrimination has been the same, except I say the same. And in fact, you could say that with time, it has increasingly become worse. Because the regime of a minority like Kagame's has to increasingly rely on brute force to maintain itself. It probably would compete with the one it removed from power from the Habyarimana regime, because it too was a small minority Chiga clique within the wider Hutu majority. And so it had to use a lot of brute force to maintain itself. But because now conditions in the 21st century are available for a dictatorial, violent, brutal regime to be able to dispense more force than was previously possible. The kings didn't have as much means as the colonial government had. Habyarimana had more, means than Kayibanda had. Now Kagame has more means than all these previous regimes put together to be able to control the population, dispense the violence in increasingly more brutal manner, because he is a minority within a minority in a sea of, for those who think in terms of ethnic groups, in a sea of a majority. And the majority, in our case, in our programs, the majority of Rwandans, the majority are Rwandans. But there are those who want, of course, to think in terms of saying, oh, the Hutu are the majority and the Tutsi minority. We don't even talk about the Twas. But I think the challenge that we have in answering that question, therefore, Sixbert, is to say that the foundation of building a nation is to build it based on all its citizens. And until now, there's no regime in Rwanda that has attempted to do that. It has been,
it has been based on the minorities, actually. Minorities,
yes,
or cliques.
Cliques, minority cliques,
among,
yes.
Cliques, yes. among minorities.
Yes. So the foundation,
yes.
The foundation, therefore, is all citizens equal before the law, with equal opportunity, all citizens with the rights as citizens, with obligations as well as citizens. And you build on a culture, on the good attributes of your culture, because we are Rwandese with a unique culture. Every culture is unique. We have to build, if you want to say that every time every regime comes, it has to uproot a culture and create its new culture, that's nonsense. It's not possible. The building blocks, if you assume the building blocks are the citizens of your country, and your citizens are not empty shells, they have a culture, they have a way of thinking, a way of doing things, a way of producing, a way of consuming, a way of marriage, what they do during growing up, the way they learn, all the things that they produce, all that constitutes their culture, their language. That is their culture. You have to build on the good attributes that your culture has, and you can also borrow or assimilate the positive aspects that you get from outside your own society. Because a society is dynamic, so it constantly teaches other people about its culture, just as it learns from other cultures. And so that kind of symbiosis of learning from each other, assimilating from each other, is a good attribute in many aspects of life. So culture is one of those things that we have to build on, but the foundation is really being all citizens being able to have equal opportunity, equal rights, and of course having the kind of obligations. So that's how you build a nation. But there are so many things, bad things that happen in a society that you also have learned to uproot. And we shall be talking about the things that we need to uproot because they are bad for our society and they have produced tragic results in our society. Those ones have to be uprooted.
Yes, we'll be talking more about those details in our future programs in part 1, 2, and 3. What you say there, it's very important that one strong pillar, it's the culture. The leaders, they come and go. The regimes, they come and go, but the population is always there. You are among the key players when RPF started the rebellion and attacked Rwanda in October 1990. You were young, you had dreams like many comrades. How far has RPF achieved its goal? What went wrong? And or why did RPF fail to deliver and betray the Rwandans?
Yeah, that's for many of us who are part of that struggle. We always have, in our minds, it's always, whenever you reflect on that, and it's not simply me alone, if you ask anybody who once was in the RPF and who became disillusioned by many things that have happened since 1st October 1990, you reflect, you look back 34 years later, the youthful energy we had, the commitment we had, the hard work that we put in it, the sacrifice. Many people, when you reflect on all that, there are two thoughts that come to your mind. On the one hand, it was the most, even though we had to give tremendous sacrifice and give a lot of our useful energy to that enterprise of changing a nation, of going back home, of transforming society. Sacrifice, yes, but I look back, I have no regrets. Absolutely, I have no regrets. I've had a problem with many people who do not like the current RPF regime, and of course now I'm one of them, and I have given reasons why I don't like it and why I resist it, why I fight it. But on the other hand, for that period of time, on the 1st of October until 1994 and thereafter, although, the thinking keeps on changing, I have no regrets because for a young person of my age who was a refugee, a Tutsi refugee, having grown up in those refugee camps of Burundi, of Tanzania, of Uganda, being a refugee in Congo or Kenya or anywhere on this planet, in itself is a school that teaches you that you do not belong elsewhere. So for us to have grown, we're young adults, very idealistic and very ambitious, to have thought that if our country cannot take us back, we shall take back ourselves. For us to have posed that question and attempted to give an answer is something that we should be proud of. And I'm proud of it And when I tell my children, I wouldn't so when they ask me, why are we here? Why are we refugees? But we're in the struggle. I tell them the struggle at that time posed the question, and I'm glad I responded to it. So on the one hand, the Sixbert, if there are people who, especially outside here in the opposition, who would hate me for that, let me repeat it once again. I have no regrets for having responded to that call. On the other hand, the second thought then becomes one of deep, deep disappointment. Because I look back, and once you've been in a revolution like that one, Sixbert, there is a level of comradeship of people you've seen die. I was one time a doctor on the battlefield. I know many of my comrades who died in my hands. I know many people have died. I know how many widows that were left behind. I know how many orphans. And then I look at what happened in 1994. Even for people who would be very sectarian and very ethnic oriented and say our people are the Tutsis, and somehow when injustice is directed against a particular group, there is no way you can avoid sometimes thinking like a Tutsi, like me. Or you, Sixbert, if you see that injustice is directed to Hutus as an ethnic group, there's no way you cannot once in a while feel that group pain or that group identity. But I look back and I look at how many people, how many Tutsis were killed in the genocide of 1994. And then casting my eyes on the horizon, and I subsequently look at how many Hutus have been killed at the hands of RPF, RPA, DMI. Then I asked myself, I started, as though on the one hand I said I have no regrets. Then I asked myself, but was it worth it? Was this enterprise worth it? That yes, would go back home, but no, we would not achieve the unity that we claimed we're coming to build. We wouldn't have reconciliation. We've not had democracy. We've not had the rule of law. We've not had the fundamental rights of the people. We've not had equal opportunity. We've said we would give, there would be security for people and their property. Would be good neighbors with all our neighboring countries. And instead, right now, we are perpetual at war. We've been fighting since 1990 up to now. And we're at loggerheads with literally everyone in the region. But above all, looking at how many people, those who died on the battlefield and those who died because of the genocide, whether those claimed by the regime of the day, the Emirati regime, or those killed by RPF among the Hutus, then I asked myself, was it worth it? Was it worth it? And yet, unlike the Habyarimana regime, and unlike the Kayibanda regime, we in the RPF had the benefit of knowing more history of what had happened to our country until that time, until 1990. We knew the problems of, although our cry was really to go back home. Let nobody deceive you. I've had this kind of, yes, there was this broad idea of young people. Many of us were even Marxists, and we had studied this historical materialism and, and all this, the nature of history, and we studied the world history and all the revolution that taken place. But the bottom line was that we are going back home. But we wanted to build on going back home to build a more sustainable future. That is something that kept on growing in the course of our struggle. Although our struggle, really, one of the problems was it was a short period of time, 4 years of war. Maybe that was not sufficient to build sufficient mechanisms and institutions within our organization and make sure that leadership becomes attuned to the requirements of society and the requirements of the organization. And that subsequently produced the monster Kagame. But that will be another program to talk about that. But I think when I look back, that we had that commitment to do all that. And we had an opportunity of looking at history from the kings up to Habyarimana when we invaded 1990. All of a sudden, all those things, now when you sum up, there is no modern organization in the history of Rwanda that has betrayed Rwanda more than the RPF. Because it was, if Habyarimana and his clique of military people could simply, do whatever they wanted, okay, you could say, okay, these are military guys and they don't care. They didn't care. But I think RPF, knowing what kind of sacrifice they had to give and the kind of sacrifice the country had to give in order for it to be in power, the Tutsis, the Hutus, and what has taken place in these last 30 years, I think RPF will be condemned in history in the worst possible terms, in the most vicious terms, in the most unkind terms, for having betrayed the Rwandan people when it had an opportunity to do something better.
Yeah,
better than
right,
Habyarimana and better than Kayibanda, better than the colonial authorities, and better than the kings. But it has failed and failed miserably.
Yeah, you are right, because the sacrifice was so big. When we see the figure of people who died during the genocide against the Tutsis and the Hutus who were killed thereafter, we are counting in terms of millions, like 2 millions of Rwandans died from 90 to today.
We don't even know. We don't know,
but
because
still
we don't want
the
to
figures
account.
are very high. Figures are very high. Yes. We will go deeper into that in our next programs. What could be the prerequisite for a new start? How could we mobilize Rwandans from, all Rwandans to understand that if they want to leave their children in a prosperous Rwanda, the time is now. They need to choose now and to start walking the steps of recovery now.
The starting point is our mindset, because here we are talking about the most difficult thing in human organization is societal change. Every time we are talking about creating a new order from the old order, building a new Rwanda from the old one, as you've seen, especially in the case of Rwanda, although we are not unique in that sense, transitions are always extremely difficult and extremely dangerous. You've seen that every transition in Rwanda has produced chaos and conflict. Every transition has always almost been violent until now. Maybe the kings had built some kind of mechanism in which, in most cases, there was no violence, but even for them, they are not free from violence. As we said, at the coup of Ruchunchu at the end of the 19th century was an extremely violent phenomenon. But subsequently, colonialism itself is a violent phenomenon, because one foreign society takes over another indigenous society on the basis that it is stronger militarily. That is what happened in Rwanda as elsewhere. And then 1959 was violent. 1973 transition to military rule and continuation of one-party rule, but a different party was a violent phenomenon. And of course, RPF coming to power was the most violent in the entire history of Rwanda. So transitions are extremely difficult in Rwanda. They're extremely violent, and successive ones become more and more violent. You can imagine if you think in terms of transition, especially if you are simply thinking about regime change. That's why we need to do more homework, and that's why we need to be more innovative, to think about some new solutions of effecting transitions. And we have to think about, sometimes to think about reforms where the old things that are not completely broken or dangerous, we can build on them. But also we have to think about innovative ways of uprooting old ways that stand in the way of transitional change. And in subsequent programs, we shall be elaborating more and more on what these new innovations are, on what these reforms in change we could undertake. But we shall also be, unfortunately, giving a very unpalatable message, very bitter medicine, which should go into curing or overcoming the disease that has run through centuries in our society, from the kings to the colonial authorities to the First Republic under Kayibanda, Second Republic under Habyarimana. I don't know. Why don't we even call this one the Third Republic? Sixbert, remind me. Is Kagame's Republic the third one or what? I don't know. But I don't know why it's always...
Officially, it's a republic with no number.
With no number. Yes.
Yeah, it's not the third, it's not the second. So it's
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So to answer your question, transitions are very, very difficult. There's no easy way. But the only thing that we have to begin with, on which we conclude, hopefully, this program today, is our mindset, how we think, what we are thinking about. Because the mindset, every plan, everything that you want to, whether you want to have children, if you want to have children, you plan to have marriage and to have children. But it begins in your mind. You must have thought, oh, I want to have a wife and I want to have children. If you want to build an organization, to build a business, you have to know what kind of business you want to build. It begins in your mind. If you want to build a house, it begins with your mind. Everything very substantial and decisive and important begins with the mind. So at the individual level and at the level of all of us, and the one thing we have in common is that we are Rwandese. But even amongst Rwandese, it's okay if you want to think that you are Hutu or Tutsi or Twa or Chiga or Nduga or whatever. That's okay too, but that's not what you have in common with in terms of citizenship. The only thing we have as citizens of Rwanda is that we're Rwandese people. All the other identities that we have, that's our business. That's my private business, because even for me here in America, I have multiple identities across my life. I've been a doctor, I've been a soldier, I have been a diplomat, I have been a consultant, I belong to a church, we belong to many, many other things, and being Tutsi is one of them. But it's in the background for me. It only comes to the surface when I'm persecuted and other people are persecuted because they are Tutsis. And my heart grieves even when a Hutu is persecuted because he is a Hutu, or a Twa is persecuted because he's a Twa. And boy, we talk about us, the Tutsis and Twas, the Twa and the Hutus and Tutsis, but the Twas, I think in our history, I think history will judge us very harshly also, the Hutus and Tutsis, for what has happened to the Twas. And so, as if we think in terms of Rwandan people, and we know that what is going on in our country is extremely dangerous, because it's a behavior that looks at the behavior of previous regimes that were able to be established, then grow, then decline, and finally collapse. Anybody sitting on this ship, Kagame's ship, and is not thinking that this ship is sinking, is deceiving herself or deceiving himself. Because this ship is sinking like the previous ones, because the fundamentals, the foundation of this ship is as flimsy, is as weak, if not weaker than the previous one. So there's no doubt it's going to collapse. And so the question will be, where will you be? Or what will you do? Do you want to drown with this ship? Or do you want to do something that might be able to salvage this ship called Rwanda and be able to, you talked about the flight of the Phoenix, be able to build from the parts of this old Rwanda, this old shrinking ship, and be able to build something new that will be able to sustain itself in the future. And that is why we call these programs Building a New and Sustainable Rwanda.
Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, thank you so much indeed for your leadership and dedication. We'll be talking more about the old and collapsing Rwanda versus the new sustainable one. Of course, it's a very huge dream because it is involving everyone. Would you like to take a minute or two to give a closing comment to this program?
Well, I would say two things in conclusion. One is that we have to overcome fear. Fear is a very big tool, very big weapon in the hands of a regime like Kagame's. In fact, if there's any big weapon that Kagame has, it's not the Katyushas and the artillery pieces and planes and money and DMI and all these things. The big weapon that he has is we, and especially the fearful we. Because once we are fearful, and that is entrenched in our minds, we are not able to...
You mentioned DMI. Could you explain what is DMI? Because some of our listeners don't know anything about Rwanda, or they know very little.
Yes, DMI, it's the collective that we call Directorate of Military Intelligence. We shall come back to that, though. There will be a program specifically on DMI, which is very collective with the intelligence, both informal and formal intelligence services of Kagame, of the RPF, that is able, really, it's the tool that he uses, especially to instill fear in families, in individuals, in communities from hill to hill, within the country, in governments, in all institutions, in civil society, and across the whole world. And this is the tool that he uses, especially in hunting down the opponents of the regime and assassinating them abroad. So it's the most vicious tool that he has. It's one of the vicious tools that he has. But I'm saying the even more important in Kagame's toolkit of weapons to use against the population is ourselves, the fear that we have. Because once we are fearful, we cannot overcome. And fear is born in the mind. That's why I said in an earlier question to you, Sixbert, it begins with our mindset. So fear is a very potent weapon in the hands of the Kagame regime. as it was during the Habyarimana regime, as it was, previous regimes, but it has even grown exponentially during the RPF regime. So our fear, and we have to overcome it. But the second part, I want to assure the Rwandan people who listen to this program is that we must have hope in the future, because not to have hope is to die. Anybody who does not have hope in a better future for his or her children, for our grandchildren, who thinks that all is lost, that it's not possible, that person actually dies. In Kinyarwanda, there's a saying, gupfu hagaze, yapfuye hagaze, that you are just still alive, but you are dead. You are dead in soul, you are dead in spirit, you are dead in mind, you are paralyzed by future, you are hopeless. That is to be hopeless. It's even an insult. If somebody calls you hopeless, it's an insult. So we cannot afford not to have hope. We must have hope. This new Rwanda we are trying to build, even amidst all the suffering that we see around us in Rwanda, we must have hope. And number three, to tell the Rwandan people that we shall overcome, that it's possible to overcome, because we are not alone. Human history always shows across the entire landscape of history, from all other societies that we know in Africa, in elsewhere, whenever people in their mindset have decided that they are going to overcome their fear, that they are going to hope for a better future for themselves, for their children and their grandchildren, and whenever they have worked together, that's putting together your efforts, not fighting in a small corner in isolation, but fighting as, resisting as Rwandans, resisting as people wanting to build a future for all Rwandans, where we have equal opportunity, where we have equality before the law, good laws, not equality before bad laws, and where there are institutions that govern us, where there is leadership that is chosen amongst the people, instead of a ruler who says, I was born with divine powers and I'm here to stay until I want to go, until I die, where there is at least that rule of law, and the basic rights of the people, where you wake up and say, I'm glad I'm Sixbert. I can go wherever I want. I can say whatever I want. I can do whatever I want, as long as what you're doing and what you're saying is not actually impinging, stepping on the toes of your fellow citizen. Then that thing, you are free to do it, which is not the case right now. So in summary then, I would implore all Rwandans to overcome fear, to have hope, and to embrace that new future, because that new Rwanda, that new future, first accept it in your mind, embrace it in your mind, because if you don't, you won't even work for it, and it won't come if you don't work for it. So first embrace it in your mind, receive it, and then it will come. And then believe that together we're going to overcome. Sixbert, I think I would wish to conclude with those few words.
Yeah, again, thank you so much indeed for that wonderful dream you are sharing with all of us in very well-phrased words. Let's build a new sustainable Rwanda. This program is brought to you by Radio Television ISHAKWE, the voice of ISHAKWE Rwanda Freedom Movement, an opposition party in exile. We are broadcasting from Washington, D.C., United States of America, every Monday at 3 p.m. Today's program presenter was Sixbert MUSANGAMFURA. Our guest Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, Chairman of ISHAKWE, Rwanda Freedom Movement.